All right, so going into 2021, the Texas A&M are going to have huge expectations for the SEC West. They return a lot of production from the defensive side of the ball with guys like Damani Richardson, Jalen Jones, O'Neal, Jalen Jones. I mean, A&M, they're going to have the most stacked secondary, probably the second most stacked secondary, or you can make an argument that, yeah, they're going to have the most stacked secondary along with the LSU football Tigers as far as just having one of the best secondaries. I'd even mention guys like Eric Young, who was very, very productive as a nickel corner. They're also going to be bringing in even more production when you're talking about the last couple of recruiting classes from their secondary, so they're going to be building a lot of depth there. The defensive line with guys like with Clemens and McKinley Jackson and Pevy there, just to give you guys a couple of mentions. With, of course, looking at guys from the 2020 recruiting class, five-star DeMarvin Lill is still going to be there as well. Now, they do lose some production there with Bobby Brown. Bobby Brown was an absolute beast for them in the interior. You also lose another linebacker as well. I think his name was Johnson, I believe. I think his name was Bobby John. I think his name was Johnson. I'm not entirely too sure, but they do lose their starting inside linebacker. If you guys can let me know what his name was in the comment section, I really would appreciate it. But yeah, he was a big deal for them as well. So you do lose a couple of starters, huge, impactful starters. But otherwise, A&M returns a majority of that production, and you're talking about Texas A&M as being one of the best defenses in the country last year. So the fact that you're returning a majority of that production and losing some rotational players as well, it's not going to be that big of a deal, especially with all the production that A&M is going to be recovering. A&M should still have one of the best defenses in the SEC, if not the best defense in the SEC. And again, we got to mention the last 3 to 4 recruiting classes that Jimbo Fisher has kind of been that Jimbo Fisher's kind of brought in over the years. We got to factor that into the defensive production. Now, offensively, yes, they're losing a lot of talent. I mean, first of all, it starts off with losing guys like Kellen Mond. That's your starting quarterback. He's been your starting quarterback for 4 years. And even though he's one hell of a football talent, he hasn't really gotten A&M over the hump. Even when they were 5th, you didn't really feel like A&M's offense was responsible for them going to where they wanted to go, and that's honestly being in 5th place, being outside of the college football playoffs, and then, of course, winning a New Year's Six Bowl game against North Carolina. Because if you look at their season, I mean, they got crushed by Alabama. Alabama is the standard. And they did lose one game, and they won everything else in the SEC. That's very, very impressive. But they got crushed by Alabama. Bama put up over 50 points against A&M. Wasn't really a close game. And really, it's been like that since Kellen Mond was once the starter back in 2017. Right? When he was the starter back in 2017, that's the closest that A&M has ever gotten to beating Alabama when Alabama won that game 27-19. So again, the Alabama Crimson Tide, that is the benchmark. If you want to win the SEC, you got to beat Alabama. And we've seen this team improve over the last 3 years, but you have to beat the big dog in order for you to get to where you want to go. So offensively, it really doesn't help that you're losing a lot of production. Again, Kellen Mond has been their starter, and he hasn't really been the most helpful quarterback in the world of getting past Alabama. But the fact that you're losing a 4-year starter, that's a big loss. Now, you do have Haynes King, who's a former 5-star quarterback, right? He's a former 5-star quarterback. He saw a little bit of playing time, a little bit of action. But is Haynes King, is he ready enough for the Texas A&M Aggies to lead the role as starting quarterback for your Aggies? I'm just not too sure if he's ready for that role yet. Now, again, obviously he's a very, very talented quarterback. He's a dual-threat quarterback. But, again, we should see some competition there for them at that spot. Again, I don't really know any notable backup quarterbacks there. I just know that Haynes King has been projected to be the guy. We'll see if he takes that role. But again, he's extremely talented. Let's see what he does. Now, they do return some weapons, right? Guys like Adonis Smith. Smith was this running back receiving hybrid that he reminds me a lot of James White. You can line him up out wide. You can line him up in the slot. You can line him up in the backfield. And again, he's this hybrid that you can pair with Isaiah Spiller in the backfield in some situations. But just a weapon, just a very, very versatile weapon that the A&M Aggies and Jimbo Fisher that they love to use. That's a big weapon to have. Again, Isaiah Spiller, he was your leading rusher a couple years ago. He had over 1,000. He had over 1,200 rushing yards. This year, I'm not too sure if he did get to 1,000, but he was one of the best running backs by far in the SEC. Now, your offensive line, you're losing, I think, three out of the 5 starters of your offensive line. That's a big loss. This was a very, very experienced offensive line, and a lot of those guys declared for the NFL. That's not easy to replicate. Again, when you're going against Alabama, when you're going against the LSUs of the world, when you're going against some of the more talented teams in the SEC, especially in your division, it is not helpful that you lose a majority of your offensive line. Now, you do return Green. You do have Kenyon Green. You got Chris Morris. So you got some talent. Then obviously they've recruited well on the offensive line for years. But they need to, but again, it starts up with the trenches. And they have to find a way to try to replicate the production. I'm going to say replicate. They have to replicate the production that the offensive line did, because it was a borderline elite offensive line. And if you want to win the SEC, if you want to get far and get to the college football playoffs, you got to have an elite offensive line. We'll see if they can kind of try to at least come close to replicating what they did last year. Receivers, Chapman is returning. I know he had a huge injury last year. That's a big gain for them that they have Chapman. Demas was a 5-star for their 2020 recruiting class. Extremely talented receivers, dominated 7-on-7 camps. But he had a major injury before the season even started. So you get that returning production. So you get that returning player back and get to see if he's worth the 5-star status. Lane's also returning back as well. And again, you got Smith that you can line up in the slot or out wide. So for the Texas A&M Aggies, they're a little, I don't want to say inexperienced or they're not talented there. They're extremely talented there. We just need to see production. We got to see some film. We got to see some footage. There's really not a lot of footage on these guys compared to what we saw the last couple of years when you knew A&M had some really, really solid receiving cores. Now, Whittemire is your tight end. Whittemire is a guy that is a linebacking safety mismatch. He's a problem in the slot or out wide, especially in red zone situations. Baylor Cupp is a guy that is a tight end that's a 5-star, extremely talented tight end, just really can't stay healthy. I don't know what happened to him in 2020, but for what I've heard, really hasn't had the healthiest of seasons. We all know Whittemire is a mismatch nightmare out wide in the slot in red zone situations. So A&M has gotten some experience at the receiving core. It's just more of those outside guys, more slot guys that we kind of need to see. Because again, A&M, you got to be elite. And we've seen A&M become a borderline elite team. And the fact that they're losing a lot of that production again. And we all know the defense was responsible for putting A&M in the position that they were. Kellen Mond did not lead this offense, or this offense didn't really lead the charge. It was the defense that did that. So I know I'm being a little hard or a little critical on this offense, but in order for them to be elite, that's where they need to be. Looking at their schedule, it's not really a hard schedule. As a matter of fact, you make an argument it's an easy schedule. You look at non-conference opponents, they really don't play anybody that tough. You get 2 FCS games. You play Kent State. And then, really, if you look at the SEC East competition, you're playing Missouri, which Missouri, they're no slouch. Missouri's no slouch at all. Missouri's probably going to be an average to maybe sub-average football team. But you play Missouri and you play South Carolina. And I just don't think that's really hard for them. Besides that, really, it's Alabama, LSU. I don't think Auburn's really going to be that much of a good football team this year. Maybe Arkansas can Arkansas, that game is always a little bit of a challenge for them, as that's a rivalry game. But really, Alabama and LSU are really the only 2 teams that are in their way. And even though you look at last year, and again, A&M went through everybody, they couldn't get through Alabama. And LSU is going to be a lot better. They're going to be a lot. They're talented as hell. They're going to be a lot more better, and they're going to have a new fresh coaching staff, which they're going a lot younger there. So I think LSU will be better. Bama will continue to be Bama. And in order for A&M to get over that hurdle, they need to get past those juggernauts if they want to get to the college football playoffs.